The air in the grand foyer still carried the faint, cloying scent of funeral lilies, a ghost of the man who had built this empire. But for Amber Collins, it was the smell of victory. She ran a manicured hand over the cool marble balustrade, her reflection shimmering in the polished surface. Richard Blackwood was gone, and his world was now hers. The will had been clear, a final testament of his love read aloud in a stuffy law office, leaving his grieving widow with little more than a polite nod. Amber had won. She had the mansion, the money, the life she had been promised. She stood as the new queen in Blackwood Crest, unaware that the quiet, defeated wife Eleanor had not yet played her final card, a single folded piece of paper, hidden for years, waiting for this very moment to turn a triumph into ashes. The day Richard Blackwood's heart finally gave out was the day Amber Collins's life truly began. She had cried, of course. She performed the role of the devastated secret love with an authenticity that surprised even herself. The tears were real, but they were tears of release, not of loss. For 5 years, she had been the shadow, the whispered secret, the other woman in the life of the real estate magnate. She had endured clandestine meetings in 5-star hotels, borrowed apartments and hushed dinners in dimly lit restaurants miles from their home in Greenwich, Connecticut. She had tolerated the condescending glances from his inner circle, who knew of her existence but treated her like a temporary indulgence. Now standing in the vast, echoing hall of Blackwood Crest, she felt a seismic shift in the universe. She was no longer a secret. She was the successor. The funeral had been a masterpiece of tasteful sorrow. Eleanor Blackwood Richards' wife of 25 years was the perfect picture of patrician grief. Dressed in a severe black Chanel suit, her face veiled and unreadable. She stood by the graveside, flanked by her 2 college-aged children, Olivia and James. They had their mother's composure and their father's dismissive eyes. Amber had watched from a respectful distance, a solitary, beautiful figure in a bespoke black dress that Richard had bought for her. She had caught James's eye once. The look he gave her was not of shared grief, but of pure, unadulterated loathing. It thrilled her. His hatred was a validation of her importance. Now a week later the mourners were gone, the sympathy casseroles had been given to the staff, and the oppressive quiet of the 20,000-square-foot mansion had settled in. Amber walked through the rooms as if in a dream. This was her home now. She traced the spines of the leather-bound books in Richard's library, their gold-leaf titles glittering under the recessed lighting. She ran her fingers over the cool silk of the drapes in the formal dining room, imagining the dinner parties she would host. She pictured herself replacing the severe ancestral portraits with vibrant modern art, sweeping away the stale legacy of the Blackwood dynasty and replacing it with her own. Her friend, Chloe, had called her that morning. "Are you okay? I mean, really?" Amber had laughed, a light, airy sound that felt foreign in the solemn house. "I'm better than okay, Chloe. I'm arriving. And the witch. Eleanor. She's holed up in the East Wing, probably counting her pearls and plotting my demise," Amber said, examining a heavy crystal decanter on a silver tray. "Let her. Her reign is over." "Richard told me, Chloe. He promised me. Everything I have, everything I am, is for you, Amber. She just doesn't know it yet." The promise had been her lifeline. Richard was a man of grand gestures and even grander words. He had painted a future for her so vivid it felt more real than her present. He'd described how he was tired of his sterile, passionless marriage to Eleanor, a woman he claimed was more of a business partner than a wife. He'd told Amber that Eleanor was cold calculating and cared only for the Blackwood name and the status it afforded her. "She's a museum piece, darling," Richard used to say, his hand stroking Amber's hair. "Beautiful to look at, but you'd never want to live with it." In contrast, he called Amber his wildfire. She was passion, life, and color in his monochrome world. He had given her an allowance that dwarfed the salary of a corporate CEO, an apartment in Manhattan that overlooked Central Park, and a black Amex card with no limit. But the real prize had always been Blackwood Crest. It was the symbol of his kingdom, and he had promised her the throne. The call from Richard's lawyer, a dry, humorless man named Marcus Abernathy, had come yesterday. The reading of the will was scheduled for the following Monday at his downtown office. "Mrs. Blackwood will be in attendance, as will the children," he'd stated, his tone giving nothing away. "Your presence is required, Miss Collins. Required." The word was music. It was official. She was no longer a footnote. She was a protagonist in the final chapter of Richard Blackwood's life. As she drifted into the master suite, a room she had never been allowed to enter, she felt a shiver of transgression and triumph. It was opulent but sterile, decorated in shades of cream and beige. Eleanor's touch was everywhere, the perfectly ordered vanity, the scent of lavender potpourri, the collection of antique silver hairbrushes. On Richard's side of the bed, a photo frame was turned face down. Amber picked it up. It was a picture of him and Eleanor on their wedding day, young and impossibly perfect. A pang of something jealousy-pity stabbed at her, but she quickly smothered it. She placed the photo back down, still face first, and walked to the vast bay window that overlooked the sprawling gardens. The autumn leaves were a riot of gold and crimson. She saw a figure below, walking slowly along the gravel path. It was Eleanor, a solitary figure in the fading afternoon light. Even from this distance, her posture was ramrod straight, her gait measured. She didn't look like a woman who had just lost everything. She looked like a general surveying a battlefield. Amber smirked. Let the old queen have her final walk through the grounds. A new era was about to begin. The will would be read, the deed would be done, and Eleanor Blackwood would become nothing more than a ghost in the house that was now rightfully hers. The law offices of Abernathy, Cromwell and Finch were the physical embodiment of old money, dark mahogany, the smell of leather and paper, and a silence so profound you could hear the motes of dust settling. Amber felt a tremor of nervous energy as she was shown into the conference room. She had chosen her outfit with the care of a warrior dressing for battle, a cream-colored silk blouse, sharply tailored black trousers and heels that clicked with defiant confidence on the polished hardwood floors. Eleanor was already there, seated at the head of the long table. She wore a simple navy blue dress, a single strand of pearls her only adornment. Her silver blonde hair was pulled back in a severe chignon, and her face was a mask of serene neutrality. Olivia and James sat on either side of her, a united front of cold hostility. James's jaw was clenched, and Olivia refused to even look in Amber's direction. Amber took the seat offered to her by Mr. Abernathy directly across from Eleanor. The space between them felt like a chasm. For a moment their eyes met. Amber had expected to see hatred, grief, or fear in Eleanor's gaze. Instead, she saw nothing. It was like looking into the calm, grey surface of a frozen lake. It was unnerving. Mr. Abernathy cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the tense room. He adjusted his spectacles and picked up a thick vellum document bound in a blue ribbon. "We are gathered for the reading of the last will and testament of Mr. Richard Allen Blackwood, dated the 10th of April, 2024. He droned on through the legal preamble, his voice a monotonous hum. Amber's heart pounded against her ribs. This was it, the culmination of 5 years of waiting, of believing. To my beloved children, Olivia and James Blackwood, Abernathy read, I bequeath the entirety of my stock portfolio to be divided equally and held in trust until their 30th birthdays. This includes all shares in Blackwood Properties, Inc., ensuring they maintain a controlling interest in the family business. Amber saw James nod slightly, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. So they got the company. Fine. She didn't want the burden of running a business. She wanted the lifestyle it provided. Furthermore, the contents of the Blackwood family vault, including all jewelry, historical documents, and bearer bonds, are to be passed directly to my children, to be managed by their mother until they come of age. Abernathy paused and took a sip of water. Eleanor remained motionless, her hands folded calmly on the table. To my wife, Eleanor Dubois Blackwood. He continued, and Amber leaned forward, barely breathing. I leave the Manhattan penthouse apartment on Park Avenue, the summer cottage in the Hamptons, and a living stipend of $250,000 per annum to be drawn from my primary investment accounts. Amber almost laughed out loud. A stipend, an apartment. It was an insult, a pittance compared to the scale of Richard's wealth. It was a public declaration that Eleanor was no longer the main event, but a footnote, a charity case. She risked a glance at Eleanor, expecting to see a crack in the icy facade. Nothing. Not a flicker of an eyelash. Abernathy cleared his throat again, a sign that he was approaching the main clause. And now he said, his voice dropping slightly. We come to the matter of the primary residence. The air crackled with tension. This was the crown jewel. The estate known as Blackwood Crest, located at 150 Old Mill Road, Greenwich, Connecticut, including the main house, all outbuildings, the surrounding 100 acres of land, and all art and furnishings contained therein, I bequeath in its entirety to Miss Amber Collins. The words hung in the air, beautiful and brilliant. Amber felt a dizzying wave of euphoria. She had done it. He had kept his promise. It was all hers. She could feel the burning hatred from Olivia and James, and it was like fuel to her fire. Furthermore, Abernathy continued, his eyes fixed on the page, to ensure her comfort and the upkeep of the estate. I have established a trust in Ms. Collins' name. The principal of this trust is $20 million, which will provide for all property taxes, maintenance, staff salaries, and personal expenses associated with her new station in life. $20 million. She felt faint. It was more money than she had ever imagined. Abernathy set the will down. That concludes the reading. For a long moment, there was silence. Then James slammed his hand on the table. This is a joke. He was obviously not of sound mind. We'll contest this, Mother. We have to. Olivia's voice was a venomous whisper. He bought her. He bought her the house, the art, everything. She's nothing but a glorified prostitute, and he's rewarding her for it. Amber's face flushed with anger, but she held her tongue, forcing a small, pitying smile onto her lips. Through it all, Eleanor remained silent. Finally, she raised a hand, and her children fell quiet instantly. She looked not at Amber, but at Mr. Abernathy. Is the document properly signed and witnessed? Marcus? She asked, her voice as cool and clear as a bell. It is Eleanor. 2 witnesses, a notary. It is by all legal standards, ironclad. Eleanor nodded slowly. Very well. She rose from her chair with a quiet grace that was more commanding than any outburst. "James, Olivia, we're leaving." But Mother James protested. "We can't just let her." "The will has been read." Eleanor said, her voice firm, cutting him off. She turned her gaze for the first time directly onto Amber. The emptiness was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like pity. "Congratulations, Miss Collins. You have the house. I do hope it brings you everything you desire." And with that, she swept out of the room, her children trailing behind her like a royal retinue. Amber was left alone in the conference room, with the lawyer, her victory so total and absolute, it felt unreal. She had won. She had faced down the Blackwood family and emerged the victor. The Ice Queen had abdicated her throne without a fight. "Well," Amber said, a triumphant laugh finally bubbling up. "That went better than I expected." Mr. Abernathy simply gathered his papers, his expression unreadable. "A copy of the will and the trust documents will be messengered to you this afternoon, Miss Collins. The estate keys are already in your possession. The property is officially yours." He paused, looking at her over the rim of his glasses. "As Mrs. Blackwood said, I do hope you enjoy it." There was an odd inflection in his voice, a strange note she couldn't quite place. But she dismissed it. It was probably just the disapproval of a stuffy old lawyer, loyal to the old regime. It didn't matter. Nothing mattered except the glorious, undeniable fact that Blackwood Crest belonged to her. The first week of Amber's reign was a blur of heady power. She moved her things from the Manhattan apartment into the master suite of Blackwood Crest, an act that felt both sacrilegious and deeply satisfying. She hired a team of movers to pack up every last trace of Eleanor. Her clothes, her books, her antique vanity set. All of it was carefully boxed and sent to a storage unit, a courtesy Amber felt was magnanimous. She was, after all, the victor, and victors could afford to be generous. Her first major act, as lady of the manor, was to reclaim the space. The house, while beautiful, felt steeped in Eleanor's cold, classical taste. It was a museum, not a home. Amber wanted life, color, and glamour. She called a renowned interior designer, Julian Vance, a man known for his bold, modern aesthetic. Together they swept through the mansion like a conquering army. "This dreadful beige has to go," Julian declared in the grand salon, waving a dismissive hand at the silk-paneled walls. "We need jewel tones, emerald sapphire, perhaps a touch of amethyst." And this portrait, Amber said, pointing to a massive oil painting of a grim-faced Blackwood ancestor over the marble fireplace. "It looks like it's judging me. I want it gone. Replaced with a Rothko. Perhaps," Julian suggested, his eyes gleaming. Or a Warhol. Something with energy. They planned to rip out the heavy damask curtains and install floor-to-ceiling glass to let the light in. They would replace the staid Georgian furniture with sleek Italian designs. The library, with its dusty smell of old paper, would become a state-of-the-art screening room. Amber felt a thrill with every proposed change. She wasn't just redecorating. She was erasing Eleanor. She was stamping her own identity onto the very bones of the house. The staff was another matter. The housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, a stern woman who had been with the Blackwoods for 30 years, regarded Amber with thinly veiled contempt. The chef Pierre, who had been trained in Lyon, suddenly found his culinary inspiration had vanished. The groundskeepers seemed to busy themselves in the farthest corners of the estate whenever she appeared. "You'll need to understand, Miss Collins," Mrs. Gable had said, her voice stiff with disapproval. This house has a certain way of being run. A rhythm. Well, the rhythm is about to change. Mrs. Gable Amber had replied sweetly. We'll be entertaining far more often. I want this house to feel alive, not like a mausoleum. To prove her point, she decided to throw a party. Not a stuffy black tie affair like the ones the Blackwoods used to host, but a real party. She invited everyone she knew friends from her gallery, days, social media influencers, a few up-and-coming artists, and Chloe, of course, as her guest of honor. The night of the party, Blackwood Crest was transformed, a DJ set up in the grand salon, thumping bass echoing where once there had been only the tick of a grandfather clock. Caterers served champagne and spicy tuna tartare. Young, beautiful people laughed and danced, taking selfies against the backdrop of the opulence. "You did it, you magnificent bitch!" Chloe screamed over the music, hugging Amber tightly. "You actually did it! Look at this place, and to think just a month ago, the old bat was probably in here knitting or whatever it is that rich, boring wives do." Amber laughed, feeling dizzy with champagne and success. To new beginnings, she toasted, holding her glass high. But as the night wore on, a strange sense of unease began to creep in. Despite the noise and the crowd, the house felt vast and unwelcoming. The old portraits they hadn't yet taken down seemed to stare down at the revelers with disdain. Several times, she thought she saw a flicker of movement in the shadowy upper hallways. The staff moved through the party like ghosts, their faces impassive. Later she found one of the younger influencers, a girl named Tiffany, trying to open a large oak door at the end of the main hall. "What are you doing?" Amber asked. "Just exploring." "This place is sick," Tiffany said, rattling the heavy brass knob. "But this one's locked. What's in here?" "Oh, that's just Richard's old study," Amber said, a flicker of annoyance passing through her. It was the one room she hadn't been able to access. The key wasn't with the main set Mrs. Gable had given her. "He must have kept all his secrets in there," Tiffany said with a giggle before being whisked away by a friend. Amber stared at the door. Richard's study. He had always called it his sanctuary. Not even Eleanor was allowed inside, he'd claimed. A sudden intense curiosity gripped her. What was in there? What secrets was he hiding? The thought gnawed at her for the rest of the night. After the last guest had departed and the caterers had cleared away the debris, Amber found herself standing before the study door once more. The house was silent again, save for the hum of the climate control system. She ran her hand over the carved wood. It felt cold, final. She felt a chill that had nothing to do with the late hour. For the first time since the will reading, a tiny hairline crack appeared in her perfect facade of victory. She had the house, but a part of it, a part of him, was still locked away from her. And she suddenly realized that Eleanor, in her quiet, dignified exit, had seemed less like a woman defeated, and more like a woman who was patiently waiting. Waiting for what? The question hung in the silent, cavernous space of her new kingdom, and for the first time, Amber felt a flicker not of triumph, but of profound and unsettling dread. The euphoria of victory, like the effervescence of champagne, began to fade, replaced by the flat, sobering reality of a daily headache. Owning Blackwood Crest, Amber quickly discovered, was less like being a queen and more like being the CEO of a very demanding, very expensive and slightly malevolent small country. The bills started arriving in a deluge. The monthly invoice for landscaping was more than her old annual salary. The climate control for the wine cellar and the art collection cost a fortune. The property taxes were staggering. At first she paid them with a flick of her wrist, a giddy sense of power coming from signing checks with so many zeros. The $20 million trust Richard had left seemed like an infinite ocean of cash, but Mr. Abernathy soon disabused her of that notion. He summoned her to his office for a meeting regarding the trust's administration. Collins. He began his tone as dry as autumn leaves. While the principal of the trust is indeed $20 million. It is not a checking account. It is an investment vehicle designed to generate income. You are entitled to the income, the dividends, the interest, but you cannot touch the principal without meeting a very specific set of criteria, namely, a catastrophic loss to the estate itself, such as a fire or a flood. Amber stared at him. What are you saying? I am saying that your annual budget for the estate's upkeep and your personal expenses is approximately to $800,000. That is the projected income from the trust's investments for this fiscal year. $800,000 sounded like a lot of money, but Amber had already spent nearly a quarter of that on Julian Vance's redecorating deposit and the party. That's not enough, she said flatly. The taxes alone are over $200,000, and the staff salaries, the insurance, the utilities. I need more. I'm afraid that's not possible, Abernathy said, with no trace of sympathy. Richard was very specific in the trust's bylaws. He designed it to preserve the capital, not to have it spent down. He wanted to ensure the house would be maintained in perpetuity. Amber left the office in a cold fury. Maintained in perpetuity. It felt less like a gift and more like a gilded, exquisitely furnished cour. Richard's control was reaching out from beyond the grave, giving her the prize, but holding the purse strings so tightly she could barely breathe. Financial pressure began to mount. Julian Vance's invoices for imported Italian marble and bespoke furniture arrived, each one a small heart attack. Pierre the chef informed her that the kitchen's walk-in freezer needed a $20,000 repair. One of the ancient oak trees on the property was diseased and had to be removed at a cost of $10,000. Desperate, Amber started looking for other sources of revenue within the estate. The most obvious was the art collection. Richard had been an avid collector, and the walls were adorned with paintings she knew were worth millions. She identified a smaller Degas sketch in one of the guest bedrooms, something she thought wouldn't be missed, and decided to sell it. She contacted a private dealer she knew from her gallery days, a man named Lucian. He was discreet and efficient. He came to the house, examined the sketch, and named a price that would solve her immediate cash flow problems. They shook on it. A week later, Lucian called her back. His voice strained. Amber, we have a problem. What kind of problem? I did my due diligence, of course. Ran the provenance on the piece. It's clean, but there's a flag on it, on all of it. A flag. What are you talking about? The entire Blackwood collection. Every painting, every sculpture, every antique is registered as part of a foundational trust. The Blackwood Family Arts Foundation. According to the documents, the pieces can be loaned to museums. They can be moved between Blackwood properties for display. But they cannot be sold. Not a single piece. Amber felt the blood drain from her face. Who controls this foundation? There was a pause on the other end of the line. The trustee and sole director of the board is Eleanor Blackwood. The phone felt slick in her suddenly sweaty palm. Eleanor. It was always Eleanor. She had insulated the art, the estate's single greatest liquid asset, completely. Amber was living in a museum where she was the curator, but not the owner. She could look, but she couldn't touch. The pressure intensified. She had to let go of 2 of the junior gardeners. She put Julian's redecorating plans on indefinite hold, enduring his theatrical sighs of disappointment. The dream of filling the house with life and laughter was replaced by the grim reality of balancing a budget. The grand halls that had once seemed full of promise now felt empty and mocking. Her paranoia grew. She was convinced the staff were reporting her every move back to Eleanor. Mrs. Gable's quiet deference now seemed like SOG surveillance. When Amber complained that the central heating in the West Wing was malfunctioning, the housekeeper had simply replied, "Oh dear. The maintenance fund is usually managed by Mrs. Blackwood. I'm not sure how we are to handle such a large expenditure now." The unspoken accusation was clear. You're in charge now. You fix it. The locked study door became the focal point of her frustration. It was a symbol of everything she couldn't access. A constant reminder of the secrets Richard had kept and the power Eleanor still seemed to wield. The house was hers, but she was a stranger in it. Haunted by the ghost of a man she was beginning to realize she had never truly known, and by the shadow of a woman who was smarter and more formidable than she had ever imagined. The obsession with the locked study grew from a nagging curiosity into a consuming fire. It represented the final frontier of her conquest, the inner sanctum of Richard Blackwood's world that remained defiantly closed to her. It was, she became convinced, where the real answers were. The key to understanding the complex web of control he had spun, and perhaps a way out of the financial prison he had built for her. After weeks of fruitless searching for a key, Amber gave up on subtlety. She called a locksmith, a discreet professional recommended by a friend in the city. The locksmith, a quiet man named Mr. Sokolov, arrived with a case of intricate tools that looked like surgical instruments. He examined the heavy oak door and the antique brass lock with a practiced eye. An old Brahma lock, he murmured more to himself than to her. Very high quality. Mr. Blackwood clearly valued his privacy. Amber stood behind him, her arms crossed, tapping an impatient foot as he worked. The process was painstakingly slow. Minutes stretched into an hour. The soft clicks and scrapes of his tools were the only sounds in the silent hallway. Finally, with a solid, satisfying thunk, the lock gave way. "It's open," Mr. Sokolov announced, wiping his hands on a cloth. Amber's heart hammered in her chest. She paid. The man waited until his car had disappeared down the long driveway, and then with a deep breath, she pushed the heavy door open. The air that wafted out was stale smelling of old paper leather and faint, lingering cigar smoke. Richard's scent. For a moment, she felt a pang of nostalgia for the man she thought she had loved. She stepped inside and closed the door behind her, sealing herself in his world. The room was not what she expected. It wasn't an office of a high-powered executive. It was a deeply personal space, a reflection of the man's true self. The walls were lined not with law books, but with first editions of classic literature. A collection of antique maps was framed on one wall. A telescope stood pointed at the large window overlooking the darkest part of the estate. But it was the desk that drew her eye. A massive mahogany partner's desk. It was surprisingly neat. A single leather-bound blotter, a pen set, and a green banker's lamp. She began to search. The drawers were mostly filled with mundane things, stationary old business contracts, tax records from years past. But in the bottom right-hand drawer, tucked away beneath a stack of old financial reports, she found a locked leather box. It was a simple lock this time. A paperclip was all it took to jimmy it open. Inside was not the financial windfall she had hoped for. Instead, there were letters, bundles of them tied with faded silk ribbons. Her breath caught in her throat. Were they from her? She opened the first bundle. The handwriting was delicate feminine, but it wasn't hers. The letters were from a woman named Katerina, written from Paris, filled with passionate, poetic declarations of love. They were dated 10 years ago. The next bundle was from a Sophia in Milan, dated 7 years ago. Another from a Genevieve in London. It soon became sickeningly clear. Amber was not the first. She was not the one great love who had finally captured his heart. She was merely the latest in a long line of mistresses, each one apparently promised the world, each one eventually discarded. He hadn't called her his wildfire because she was unique. He had called her that because it was a line that worked. A wave of nausea and humiliation washed over her. Her entire 5-year relationship, the foundation upon which she had built her triumphant new life, was a sham. A recycled romance, a script he had performed time and time again. Shaking with a mixture of rage and heartbreak, she dug deeper into the box. Beneath the letters was a folder. Inside were not more love notes, but legal documents. Drafts of wills, prenuptial agreements, and trust formations. Her eyes scanned the pages, catching names and dates. She saw drafts of trusts for Katerina and Sophia, each one providing a generous severance package. He hadn't just discarded them. He had paid them off neatly and legally, severing them from his life. And then she found it. A document that made the air freeze in her lungs. It was a deed. A quitclaim deed dated 12 years ago, long before she had even met Richard. The document recorded the transfer of the property at 150 Old Mill Road, Greenwich, known as Blackwood Crest. The grantor was Richard Blackwood. The grantee was not Eleanor. It was the Blackwood Crest Irrevocable Trust. Her legal knowledge was limited, but she knew what irrevocable meant. It meant it couldn't be undone. He had transferred ownership of the mansion into a trust over a decade ago. Frantically, she searched for the trust document itself. She found a summary sheet stapled to the back of the deed. The trust was established for the sole benefit of his family. Its purpose was to preserve the ancestral home for future generations of Blackwoods. And the sole trustee, the person with ultimate legal authority over the property, the only one who could decide who lived there and who did not, was his wife, Eleanor Dubois Blackwood. The room started to spin. It didn't make sense. The will had been ironclad. Abernathy himself had said so. It had clearly bequeathed the mansion to her. She collapsed into Richard's leather chair. The letters and deeds spread before her, like the wreckage of a shipwreck. Richard hadn't given her the house. He couldn't have, because it was never his to give. The will. What was the will, then? It wasn't a legal transfer of property. It was a performance, a piece of theatre designed to humiliate his wife and install his mistress, all while knowing it was built on a foundation of lies. It was the cruelest, most elaborate joke imaginable. A final, posthumous act of psychological warfare. And Eleanor had known. She had sat in that lawyer's office listening to her husband's final betrayal, knowing it was all meaningless. Her calm wasn't defeat. It was the supreme confidence of a player holding a royal flush, waiting for her opponent to finish bluffing. She hadn't fought because she didn't have to. She had the law, the truth, and the deed on her side. She was just waiting for Amber to overplay her hand, to expose her own greed and desperation, to fully entangle herself in a fantasy, before she brought the whole thing crashing down. The click of the study door opening behind her made her jump. Amber spun around, her heart seizing in her chest. Eleanor stood in the doorway, framed by the hall light. She wasn't angry. She wasn't triumphant. She looked at the papers on the desk, then at Amber's tear-streaked, horrified face, and her expression was one of profound, weary sadness. "I believe," Eleanor said, her voice soft, but carrying the weight of destiny. "It's time we had a talk." The grand foyer, which had been the stage for Amber's triumphant party just weeks before, was now set for a very different kind of drama. Eleanor had not raised her voice, had not made a single threat. She had simply looked at Amber amidst the wreckage of Richard's secrets and said, "Let's go downstairs. Mr. Abernathy is on his way. The children are waiting." The words were a quiet command, and Amber for the first time felt completely powerless to disobey. She followed Eleanor down the sweeping staircase, like a prisoner being led to her sentencing. Her earlier rage and defiance had evaporated, replaced by a hollow, sickening dread. James and Olivia were standing by the large fireplace, their expressions grim. Mr. Abernathy stood near the main doors, his briefcase resting on a marble-topped table. He looked as always like a somber undertaker. This was not a negotiation. It was an execution. Amber stood in the center of the cold marble floor, feeling small and exposed under the glittering chandelier. Eleanor was the one to speak first. She gestured to the room around them. "It's a beautiful house, isn't it? Richard's grandfather built it. It has been in the Blackwood family for nearly a century. It is more than a house. It is a legacy." She paused, her cool grey eyes pinning Amber in place. Richard loved legacy, but he also loved chaos. He enjoyed pitting people against one another. It was his most profound and ugliest character flaw. He did it in business, and he did it in his personal life. You, Miss Collins, were the centerpiece of his final, cruelest game. The will. Amber managed to whisper the words, feeling like sandpaper in her throat. The will gave me everything. Mr. Abernathy stepped forward, opening his briefcase. The will is a perfectly legal document, Miss Collins, and it did exactly what Richard intended for it to do. It gave me the house Amber insisted, a hysterical edge to her voice. No, Abernathy corrected gently. It did not. If you will recall the precise wording which I have here. He produced a copy of the will. The estate known as Blackwood Crest, I bequeath in its entirety to Ms. Amber Collins. He looked up at her over his glasses. It's a classic misdirection, a legal sleight of hand. He bequeathed you the estate, but a person cannot legally bequeath something they do not own. He then produced a second document. It was a certified copy of the quitclaim deed Amber had found in the study. As you have now discovered, 12 years ago, Richard Blackwood transferred the deed and title of this property into the Blackwood Crest Irrevocable Trust. At that moment, he ceased to be the legal owner. He was a resident, but he had no more legal right to give this house away in his will than the gardener or the chef. The pieces clicked into place with a horrifying finality. The trust for the art, the carefully worded will, the impossibly calm wife. So the will. It was just a piece of paper, Amber asked, her voice trembling. Not entirely, Eleanor said, taking over. Her voice was devoid of malice. It was the voice of a teacher explaining a complex but undeniable truth. The will was his weapon. It was designed to install you here, to give you a false sense of ownership, to let you publicly humiliate me and my children, to watch you try and dismantle my home. He knew the trust I left for your upkeep was just enough to let you exist here, but not enough to ever be truly comfortable. He wanted you to feel the squeeze. He wanted you to become desperate. He wanted, in effect, for you to destroy yourself. James spoke for the first time, his voice thick with contempt. My father used you. He used you as a weapon against my mother, and when he was done, he set you up to self-destruct. That was his parting gift to you. Why, Amber cried out, looking at Eleanor. The question was a plea. Why would you let it happen? Why didn't you say something at the reading? You could have stopped all of this. This was the question that had been screaming in her mind. Why the elaborate, painful charade? Eleanor's expression softened just for a moment into something that resembled real sorrow. Because Richard needed to be exposed, not just to you, but to everyone. If I had produced this deed at the will reading, you would have been seen as a victim of a technicality. You would have sued the estate, dragged our family through the mud for years, claiming you were the poor, cheated mistress. The world would have sympathized with you. She took a step closer. But by letting you have your moment of triumph, by letting you move in, by letting you try to sell the art, by letting you run up against the financial walls he built for you, by letting you throw your party and crow about your victory, you exposed your own character. You showed everyone that you weren't interested in Richard's memory. You were interested in his assets. Now when this story comes out, and it will, no one will see you as a victim. They will see you as a fool, as a grasping, greedy woman who was ultimately outplayed. Richard's final cruelty was in making you the instrument of your own public disgrace. My only role was to give you enough rope. It was brilliant, it was diabolical, and it was utterly devastating. Amber looked from Eleanor's calm, intelligent face to the sneering faces of her children, to the impassive face of the lawyer. She was surrounded. There were no more moves to make. She was in checkmate. So what now? She whispered. Eleanor walked over to the grand mahogany table by the door. On it was a single folded document and a pen. It wasn't the deed. It was something else. What now, Eleanor said calmly, is you sign this non-disclosure agreement, promising to never speak or write about my husband or my family again. You will then pack a single suitcase with your personal belongings. A car will be here in 1 hour to take you back to your apartment in Manhattan, the lease for which I have just paid for another 6 months to give you time to sort out your affairs. After that, you are on your own. Eleanor picked up the hidden deed from Abernathy's pile of documents. She didn't flourish it. She just held it. It was a simple folded piece of paper, but it held all the power in the world. You thought you won the mansion? Miss Collins. Eleanor said, her voice now carrying a sharp, definitive edge. But you only ever won a temporary stay in my house, and your visit is now over. The silence that followed Eleanor's final pronouncement was heavier and more absolute than any sound Amber had ever heard. The grand foyer, which had once represented the pinnacle of her ambitions, now felt like a courtroom where an unappealable sentence had been delivered. There was no argument to be made, no loophole to be found. There was only the cold, hard weight of the truth, a truth that had been lying in wait for her all along. Numbly, Amber walked to the table and picked up the pen. Her hand shook as she signed the NDA, her signature a pathetic scrawl compared to the confident flourish she had once practiced. She had signed away her story, her anger, her only remaining asset. Mrs. Gable will show you to your room. Eleanor said, her tone businesslike, now the moment of confrontation past. 1 suitcase. The car will be at the front door in exactly 1 hour. As Amber turned to walk up the stairs for the last time, she passed Olivia. The girl's face was no longer filled with hatred. Instead, it held a look of cold, clinical pity, the kind one might give to an insect trapped in a jar. It was somehow worse than her anger. Packing was a surreal experience. Just a few weeks ago, she had triumphantly unpacked her entire life into this opulent suite. Now she was forced to choose what could fit into a single piece of luggage. The designer clothes, the shoes, the jewelry Richard had gifted her. Which of it was truly hers? It all felt like a costume from a play that had disastrously closed on opening night. She packed the essentials, leaving the silks and cashmeres hanging in the closet like ghosts of a life she never really had. An hour later, she walked down the staircase with her roller bag clicking behind her. The Blackwood family was gone. Only Mrs. Gable stood by the door, her expression as impassive as ever. A black town car was idling in the circular driveway. As Amber stepped out into the crisp autumn air, she took one last look at the magnificent stone facade of Blackwood Crest. It looked exactly the same as it had the first day she'd arrived, full of false hope. The house was indifferent to her fate. It had seen women like her come and go. It endured. The drive back to Manhattan was silent. The city skyline, which once seemed to promise endless opportunity, now looked like a wall closing her in. The apartment, once a symbol of her status as Richard's chosen woman, was now just a reminder of her foolishness. It was a gilded cage, and the 6 months of paid rent felt less like a mercy, and more like the final condescending payout for her services. The story, as Eleanor had predicted, did come out. Not as a scandalous headline, but in the way such things do in those circles, through whispers, gossip, and carefully curated leaks. The narrative was exactly as Eleanor had engineered it. Amber Collins wasn't the tragic lover. She was the overreaching fool. The story of the fake inheritance, the failed art sale, and the ultimate quiet eviction became a cautionary tale whispered at charity galas and exclusive country clubs. Amber became a punchline, a symbol of hubris, while Eleanor Blackwood was seen as a paragon of quiet strength and dignity, a woman who had weathered her husband's final pathetic betrayal with grace and intelligence. Amber tried to fight it. She spoke to a lawyer who, after hearing the story and learning of the signed NDA, told her she had no case. The will was a cruel but legal document. The deed to the trust was unassailable. She was left with nothing but a depleted bank account and a reputation in tatters. Meanwhile, life at Blackwood Crest returned to its old rhythm, but with a palpable difference. Eleanor, freed from the oppressive weight of Richard's deceptions, seemed to come alive. She had the ancestral portrait in the salon, taken down not to be replaced by a Warhol, but by a beautiful light-filled landscape by a contemporary female artist. She hosted gatherings not for social posturing, but for friends, family, and artists she genuinely admired. The house under her sole, undisputed control finally began to feel less like a museum and more like a home. She had not just won back her house. She had liberated it and herself from the shadow of the man who had sought to control them both, even in death. She had played the long game, armed not with passion or greed, but with patience, intelligence, and a single hidden deed. And in the end, that had been more than enough. What a story of quiet revenge and brilliant strategy. It's a powerful reminder that the loudest person in the room isn't always the one who holds the power. Eleanor Blackwood's story shows us that patience can be a weapon, and knowledge in her case, knowledge of the law and of her husband's true nature, is the ultimate shield. She understood that true victory isn't about a dramatic, angry confrontation, but about a calm, calculated move that changes the entire game. While Amber chased the illusion of power, Eleanor simply held onto the reality of it, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal the truth. If this story of drama, deception, and ultimate justice captivated you, please let us know by hitting that like button. Share this video with a friend who appreciates a tale of a brilliant mind at work. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next story of unbelievable twists and real-life drama. Thank you for listening.